Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here at my next and last Avatar in review video. This is going to be episode 10, Avatar The Last Airbender versus or comparison to The Legend of Korra. This is the video where I really basically address what I've talked about the past 9 episodes. Come to the conclusion like, what is the ultimate strength of both series, what's maybe the weakness of both series, and come to the conclusion of just which one I consider to be perhaps the better series. Now, personally, I don't really have a favourite between the two. I personally can't decide which one I prefer more, because I like series for different reasons, and there are a lot of things that one series I think does better than the other, and so on, and I can't really choose which one I prefer more. So this video is primarily going to be kind of this more, just what I say in this video, and the positives and negatives I say for each series, and then think about the fandom overall and stuff like that, and kind of come to the conclusion that way, like, which of these negatives is the biggest will probably decide which, overall, in general, most people will probably say this one is better than that one. That's kind of going to be the conclusion that I come to by the end of this. So, just to mention that. So, the first thing I want to talk about is probably the most important factor in deciding this debate. This is probably going to be the thing that ultimately makes up your mind as to which series you prefer more, and that is the format of both series. Avatar The Last Airbender is 61 episodes, told over 3 seasons. 20 episodes, 20 episodes, 21 episodes. It's just that one story told over those episodes. While with Korra, it's 52 episodes told across 4 seasons, 12, 14, 13, 13. So it's 4 separate stories, in one for each book, with the character arcs being the thing that kind of continues between each book. So straight away, that's a very different format right there and then. Of course, Avatar kind of does have specific stories for each book, but they're more kind of parts of an overall story, that being, each book he basically learns a new element, one of the ones he doesn't know, and that eventually helps him to the overall goal of ending the war, defeating the Fire Lord, whereas each book of Korra has its own villain, there's its own story, and Korra develops, and she's you can see the development in her as you progress into each book. So that's a very different approach to storytelling in each season. But there's a lot of other factors that come into play just with the way that things are. One of the key ones, I would say, is actually that Mike and Brian originally wanted Avatar to be and have 12 to 14 episode seasons. So, imagine Avatar The Last Airbender if there were only about, 36 to 40 episodes or something like that. It would be a very different show. And it's one of those things, like, the reason that Avatar eventually turned out the way it did, being 2020-21, was because Nickelodeon was only basically doing 20 episode seasons at the time. So Michael Brown only got Avatar approved by Nickelodeon because they agreed to do the 20 episode format. And it ended up working out very well for them, because even though their story perhaps only filled up a certain amount of those episodes, they had a lot of playroom to adapt to what the fans liked and perhaps disliked about the series as it progressed. And you can very clearly see that with stuff like, say, the character Suki. She appears first in episode 4, and originally the plan for her was that was the only episode she would ever appear in. She is this character to help Sokka get over his sexism, and also present this idea that there's going to be some romance stuff in the future for Sokka. But she was so beloved by the fans liked her so much that they decided to bring her back. This is something that went against their original plan for the series, and so they brought her back in episodes like the Serpent's Pass, and then later on in the Boiling Rock and stuff like that. And she eventually became a part of Team Avatar at the end of the series and plays an important role, all because the fans really liked her character. And the only reason they were able to do that and fit it into this otherwise show that, perhaps if it was just 12 episodes, they wouldn't have been able to do that, is because they had more episodes than they perhaps needed. And so it's a positive And perhaps also a negative for Avatar that that was the case, because book one isn't very plot focused. You know, there's so many episodes in book one where they just visit a new town. There's some characters that you only see in those episodes. You know, the Great Divide is an example, the Fortune Teller is an example, and stuff like that. And they don't ever address the overall plot, that the aim of this book is ultimately to get to the Northern Water Tribe as quick as possible and learn waterbending. Yet, over half of the episodes in the book never address that, ever. And so it's not a very plot-focused book. And you can tell, especially in book one, that there are early teething pains with the series, in terms of how plot-focused, how character-focused it actually wants to be. And 20 episodes, especially for book one, definitely kind of wasn't needed. They kind of fixed that in book 2 and 3 because they introduce a lot more plot, they introduce a lot more important character development. But you can still see that is still some space for a little bit of experimentation. Episodes like The Tales of Ba Sing Se and Appa's Lost Days, I wouldn't say that those episodes were planned very early on in production on this show, that they wanted to do this kind of weird kind of slice of life episode in Ba Sing Se, or this complete episode devoted to the flashback history of this animal and where he's been since he's been lost. But because they had more episodes than they needed, they were allowed to do that. Whereas with Korra, because Michael Brown got their wish, Nickelodeon approached them, they were allowed to do what they wanted. They were allowed to do those 12, 14, 13 episode seasons, and it means that the show is extremely tightly written. There is, I would say, on average, there is more to discuss and more to each episode of Korra compared to Avatar. Now, I specifically said on average there, because there are episodes of Avatar that there's perhaps more to discuss than certain episodes of Korra, but overall I'd say there's, in terms of just like length of a discussion you can have in each episode, Korra would probably come out overall on top in terms of just on average of episodes, because a lot of the book one episodes, they're very basic, like The Great Divide. There's not a massive amount to discuss in certain aspects. You know, the Bottom of the Water Tribe, the Fortune Teller, they're very basic episodes compared to, say, even some of the episodes in Korra that maybe people don't like the most. You know, like some of the early book 2 episodes, people tend to not like civil wars and stuff like that. There's still a ton of stuff to discuss there. The whole political stuff, the family stuff, some of the spiritual stuff going on. So there's that. But it also means that there was very little room to maneuver in terms of them changing things as the series went on, in terms of what the fan reaction was like. They were allowed to do it eventually between, I think, book 2 and 3. There were definitely some clear changes that were made. But overall, because they were so limited in that, like, they only have 13 episodes, and to make the story that they want to tell work, they have to use every single minute of time allowed to tell that story. And so when something unexpected comes up that is like a issue, it created big problems. So Nickelodeon reducing the budget for book 4 suddenly had a massive impact on book 4. Basically losing an episode to Remembrances was a huge problem, I think, with book 4, because that's 22 extremely valuable minutes of Korra that were effectively missing from the series. And when you think about, imagine what book 4 would have been if it was 13 proper episodes. That's 22 minutes, like, you could fill in a lot of blanks in that book. You could devote a lot more time to Jinora in that book. And Jinora is probably a good example for the whole, I mentioned Suki in the previous series, in terms of, this is a thing that they hadn't planned, but that they're allowed to do with the breathing room, while Jinora is something that they had planned. They clearly had this idea that she was going to be this kind of very much minor character in book 1. She was just one of the air kids. But in book 2 and 3, we're going to have some really important stuff happen revolving around her. She's going to be essential. She's going to have some big moments. Then it came around to book 4, and all of a sudden, they didn't have a lot to do with her. Arguably, Jinora is at her most important and has the most potential to become a big main character in book 4, but it's the book where she probably appears in the least. She probably appears in book 4 less than she does in book 1. Maybe I'm wrong there, but that's the way it feels. Like, she has her relationship with Kai, but it's not addressed. at all in the series, apart from Kai saying our long distance relationship is good. The two are in a scene towards the end of the book, but they don't address it. And she's not important really at all. Despite being a master airbender, they very rarely in book 4 show her skills, and in fact probably do the opposite of that. She's put at risk a couple of times in book 4 and has to be saved by other people, including her father at one point, which I don't necessarily agree with, the way that she was done there. So you have stuff like that happen. Like, there are 22 minutes that were just could have been devoted to so much else, because if you time some of the scenes in Korra, that's realistically about 22 scenes that you could have had added to book 4 that would have added so much more in stuff. Whereas, say book 2 of Avatar, say they got a notice towards the end of production that, oh, okay, sorry guys, the budget's been cut, you're effectively down to 19 episodes, but we still need you to do 20. There's much more kind of playroom in book 2 to where you could actually cut stuff out and do stuff like that to make it work. And book 2 minus 2 minutes wouldn't be the worst thing ever to happen. But with book 4, it's the final book of Korra, the last one. This is how the series is going to end, and you do that, it's a big problem. So definitely the format, I think, is a huge deciding factor in which series is overall better. But at the same time, there are positives to both formats. One story over many seasons, or one story per season, like quicker stories. It was very interesting, and I think the kind of counterpoint to that is probably my next positive, and it's probably something that Korra beats Avatar out on, and that is the villains. Because the problem, I think, with the villains / format is that because Avatar was so focused on telling one story, your main villain is just a big bad guy that the hero has to confront at the end. The story of Avatar is primarily we focus on our hero almost completely. There's other stuff happening in the background, but fundamentally we focus on Aang as he gets more powerful, as he goes through character development, while the villain is the exact same over the entire series. We get some of his history with some of the other characters, but fundamentally him as a character, he's just a villain. Whereas with Korra, because there are 4 separate stories, you have 4 chances to tell a story with individually interesting villains. And that's exactly what it did. So overall, Korra beats out Avatar in terms of villains, purely because it's a comparison between Zhao, Azula, maybe Long Feng, and Ozai versus Tarlok, Amon, Unalaq, Vatu, Zahir, Minghua, Ghazan, Pali, Kuvira, and Bataar Jr., kind of. And straight away, you're just like, in terms of quality of characters, Korra just wins. Like, Ozai, take the comics away for a second, because we're comparing the series, not the comics here. Ozai, outside of the comics, is a fairly bland character. He's manipulative, you see at times. He's a very powerful bender, and he's the current evil Fire Lord. But fundamentally, is his character any different from Sozin? Is his character any different from Azulon? Not really. They're kind of all roughly the same characters. They play the same roles. The only thing that really makes Ozai unique is that he has an impact on his children's lives and I suppose what he did to them. But primarily that's interesting for those characters. Zhao is kind of Ozai Book 1. Is kind of a less kind of a powerful version of Ozai. He represents the worst of the Fire Nation and acts as a perfect foil to Zuko in Book 1, as showing you that Zuko is not the main villain of the series, and really kind of isn't a villain because this guy is a villain. And so yeah, there's some interesting stuff with him and his history with Zhang. Zhang didn't really address that much, but he works for Book 1 as a kind of basic villain to start us off, but compared to the villains in Korra, definitely not in the same level. Azula's a bit of a different story, I think, because she is a character that has some interesting stuff going for her, being Zuko's sister, being another child of Ozai, and stuff like that, having her own arc with her friends, Mei and Ty Lee, and stuff like that. And you really see that she's the complete opposite of Zuko in many ways, in that Zuko is raised almost exclusively by Ursa, you basically find out, and Azula was basically raised almost exclusively by Ozai, just because of the way Ozai treated Zuko. This is explained more in the search and stuff like that, but fundamentally that's the situation that you're left with. So that's why Zuko ends up having the potential to be such a good leader and has all this level of caring for others and stuff like that, while Azula's skills don't have she doesn't have any of the Zuko kind of caring for others, understanding like friendships and stuff like that. She's all about manipulating people and power, controlling people through fear and stuff like that. What she learned from Ozai, she really was just his tool, and so by the end of the series, you end up feeling sympathy for her because she is the way she is, because she was raised, and you kind of understand that she's not really the villain you think she is. But at the same time, the way the series ends with her, it is just that she's gone insane, and you don't really have a moment where that sympathy gets any sort of payoff, where she has some sort of a redemption thing. They're going down that road in the comics. Clearly there's going to be something happening with her later on, probably Smoke and Shadows. But in terms of the series, she ends just as a defeated villain who you have some sympathy for. And that makes her the best villain, but not as good as the Korra villains. While with the Korra villains, what I like about them is that they all have their own ideals. It's not just all take over the world, power, like Ozai was. They all have unique, interesting things and reasons for doing what they're doing. So Amon and Tarlok obviously have this kind of family history of, their father was Yukon, who was a great villain in Republic City for a while, and he was one of the villains that was taken out by Aang. And then there's this whole psychic bloodbending plot. And the idea that these Amon and Tarlok were planned to be Yukon's tools of revenge. They left never wanting to do that, but ended up doing it anyway because of just the way things happened with that family. This almost curse on the family that they ended up doing what they didn't want to do. And the idea that bending basically ruined their family, and so you have the two sons take a different approach to this, and that like Amon actively tries to get rid of bending in the world, while Tarlok more tries to take over the city and do what his father did in a more legal way and kind of have control that way. So they're really interesting because of that. The backstory episode, Skeletons in the Closet, is amazing. Vatu and Unalaq from book 2. Vatu just he doesn't really need a character. He's the spirit of evil and chaos in the world, darkness. You don't need anything for him. He's just the most powerful villain, realistically, that Korra's going to face in the series. But she doesn't face any personal really issues with him. It's just a kind of power thing. While you get the complete opposite with Unalaq, in that she's arguably a more powerful bender than he is. But he has more spiritual stuff than her. So she learns the personal stuff from Unalaq and has the more physical fights with Vatu. And so that's interesting, and how Unalaq plays into the whole family dynamic and spirit dynamic of book 2. That's super interesting because you have him linked into the Red Lotus, and ultimately he's the person responsible for Korra being in the compound at the start of the series, which explains Korra's character arc. Of not really having much world experience at the start of the series. And you have super interesting stuff with that. The way he was linked into book 3 despite being dead at the time was fascinating. And how, you get the sense that he's jealous of his brother because his brother is the father of the Avatar. That's something he always wanted. Ultimately the goal of the Red Lotus was to capture the Avatar and train her in the way of the Red Lotus rather than the Order of the White Lotus. So she would have different ideals on the world and would change things for their ideals, which is a super interesting idea that would have come across a lot better if they had shown it in actual flashback, this whole plan taking place, but they didn't. But still, the idea that Unalaq properly teaches Korra spirituality because she's not spiritual because of her father, more or less, and he has to, even though he's using her at the time, he has to actually properly teach her to be spiritual because she's just not. And eventually, those ideals ultimately help Korra to beat Unalaq and make these decisions that in many ways define her as the Avatar. So she learned a lot from Unalaq, and even before book 4, and she kind of discovers learning from her villains. She's already done it with Unalaq in book 2, so I like that. Red Lotus, I've talked a lot about them across these series. They suffer from not really being much of characters, and the Red Lotus and the backstory and the history not being addressed too much. But as physical benders, as threats, they're amazing in book 3. But definitely the weakest villains, I think, far and away in terms of character development. But still, they're more interesting than some of the Avatar villains, just because there's so much potential for stories to be told. Kuvira, again, I think again one of the weaker villains that we got. I think book 1 and 2 have stronger villains than book 3 and 4, because again, with her, I like the whole orphan backstory and how ultimately it's all about protection for her, and that all she's really guilty of is kind of getting consumed by power after actively trying to help the world by stabilizing the Earth Kingdom when no one else could. And then obviously stuff happened. The problem with her, I think, is just that they didn't really get across massively clear what really turned her into a villain. Like, I understand that she has issues with some of the other world leaders and stuff like that, and she wants this place where people can be safe. But where does the whole kind of ethnic purging thing, getting all the other nations out of the Earth Kingdom, come from? When does the slave driving come in? When does the attack Republic City to get it back come into play? That's what I didn't quite get. That they didn't fully explain that turn into the tyrannical dictator. It wasn't as, like, Amon, you understand how he became who he did because of that backstory. That was very clear. But Kavira's backstory is like a disagreement with Sue, and she leaves with Batar and suddenly becomes evil. They could have explained that a lot better, I felt. And again, I think it comes down to the fact that Remembrances, like, they probably had more time there to tell the backstory if that episode wasn't there. So that's an issue. But fundamentally, the villains, I think, are a huge plus for Korra. In terms of, I suppose, other characters, I don't really have a massive amount to say. Like, I could probably go through comparing Team Avatar to in the first series to the new series, but I think they are very similar. Like, Korra arguably goes through more than Aang does in the series just because of the 4 separate stories, but their arcs are fairly comparable. Bolin and Sokka, again, fairly comparable in terms of the humorous character who eventually gains confidence, becomes a bit of a leader and stuff like that. Makes sense. Toph and Asami, they have these kind of arcs with their parents there. But fundamentally it's about kind of friendship, so they're fairly comparable as well. Katara and Mako is probably the comparison that ends up having to happen. That's maybe not the best, but involved in maybe some of the romance in the series, understandable. They have some maybe smaller arcs that are involved here with family and stuff like that. Fairly comparable, but Avatar overall probably has the more developed cast overall. But I think what Korra is perhaps missing in terms of its cast was a Zuko character. Was this character that was kind of off on their own, telling this other side story, in that really there's 2 main characters in Avatar, Aang and Zuko, and you get their parallel stories being told. While with Korra, the main character is Korra, and you don't really get anyone else really on that level in the series. And maybe that's what Korra was perhaps missing, just this kind of really complicated character that you didn't quite understand what was going to happen. And there was plans to potentially do that with Asami. We were hearing this very early on in book 1 and stuff like this, that the plan was for Asami to be evil, not turn on her father in episode 9, I believe, and have her be on the other side for a while and then eventually turn back. I almost think that they maybe should have gone down that road, because especially given that they were going to have Korra and Asami get together at the end, that would have been fascinating. Have them be on opposite sides at the start and then eventually come together, eventually become friends, and eventually start a relationship. That is a really interesting arc for me, more so than what they actually gave to her. But that's obviously just like fan writing at this point in time. There's just very little else to say there, but very, very comparable on characters, but overall probably Avatar has a slight edge on that road. So Korra wins on villains, but Avatar maybe wins on other characters. What else? I think the quality of episodes, I'm going to come back to this. I said before there's more to probably discuss in each episode of Korra than there is in Avatar. But I would also say that Korra has some of the best episodes of both series overall. And I think this is something that very few people talk about. But I think episodes like Beginnings Part 1, Beginnings Part 2, A New Spiritual Age, Harmonic Convergence, Harmonic Convergence, Darkness Falls, Light in the Dark, all really strong episodes, like amazingly strong. The book 3 and 4 finales are both great. You have episodes like Where Extremes Meet back in book 1, Turning the Tides in book 1, but they're all really strong episodes that are definitely in the higher tier of episodes in both series. And I think because they were so packed, they had to make those finales have such impact that they're arguably like better than many of the best episodes in Avatar. So, that's something that the format also does for Korra, and that you have some of the most intense and powerful episodes. Like, how could I forget Korra Alone? Like, it's comparable obviously to Zuko Alone by name and in what they're trying to do, but I'd say it's probably a better episode than Zuko Alone, just about, because if the story of Zuko's mother, the search, was actually told in the series, Zuko Alone would probably be a lot better than it actually is. But because the search is told through comics, in terms of just comparing series, it doesn't quite have the impact as Korra's recovery and Big Change does. So there's that. So I think maybe Korra has the slight edge on like just these super high quality episodes, but maybe I'm underestimating Avatar's best episodes, like the Southern Raiders, the finales of Korra. So that there's still that's Korra wins maybe by a slight margin there. What else is there I want to talk about? Talked about the format, episodes, characters, plot. Really format covered plot as well. Animation, I suppose, is a smaller topic. A lot of people may make a huge deal about Studio Pierrot and really bringing down the quality of animation in Book 2, but I really disagree. I think a lot of people saying this have no idea that there are 3 animation studios on both shows. Like, Studio Mir basically end up doing 45 of the 52 episodes of Korra, and then 7 episodes are done by Pierrot. But for book 3 and 4, Studio Mir are assisted on animation by Studio Reve, or Rev, as well. So that's Korra's 3 animation studios. It's a lot more complicated than Avatar, because JM Animation Studio Mir started from JM Animation, as far as I'm aware. So they're the main animation studio who do the best episodes of Avatar. I don't know the number off the top of my head, but they do just over half of the episodes of Avatar The Last Airbender. I think it's like 34 or something like that. The other half of the episodes are split between 2 animation studios. Dior Movie for book 1 and 2, and then Moy Animation for book 3. And they, especially Dior Movie, I think, are probably the worst animation studio we've had on Avatar overall. I think Pierrot are better than them. Moy and Pierrot, I think, are overall fairly comparable. So, in terms of animation consistency, Korra wins by a landslide, just because it only has 7 episodes that aren't done by the main animation studio, whereas Avatar is close to half being done by another animation studio. So there's that. And I don't understand why people don't mention that when they talk about Studio Pierrot. In addition to that, Studio Pierrot do some really cool animation stuff throughout their episodes. Like The Guide is the last episode they did, and there was some really cool stuff there. So I really like that. So animation, I'd give it to Korra, because Mir, you can clearly tell that they've improved since their time as JM Animation. So there is that. Fight scenes and bending, I suppose, in general, is a topic people really bring up, especially early on with Korra. There was definitely complaints that the bending wasn't as big or as strong or powerful as it was in Avatar. To some extent, I would agree, but I think they've kind of fixed that a little bit in book 3 and 4. That we did see some very powerful bending. We definitely didn't see the Avatar state used as much in Korra, but we have seen some otherwise really cool fights, like the Colossus versus all the Benders, basically Kuvira Korra, Zahir Korra, even just some of the other fights, like especially Book 3. The one thing the Red Lows really did involve, because there was 4 of them, and their bending was so cool, there was a lot of really cool fights between those characters, so like Mako Minghua, Bolin Gazan, even like Lin and Sue versus Pali was very good. So I think Korra has some excellent fights overall, and maybe you'd give it the slight edge, but at the same time Avatar has some great fights as well. Maybe the increased animation gives it to Korra just about, but it's still very comparable, I think. They're not too far off. I think I'm coming just about to the end of this video and the end of this series, so yeah, I'm just trying to think of any final points. I suppose character arcs is the final thing to really cover, in terms of like, I've discussed the characters individually and stuff like that, but I suppose it mainly comes down to the main character arcs, like Korra versus Aang. Again, as I said earlier on, fairly comparable. Maybe you'd give the edge to Korra just because she deals with a little bit more than Aang. Yes, Aang deals with the whole war and stuff like that, and that's been entrenched in the world for 100 years, but Korra dealing with those 4 villains and going through so much, maybe you give it the edge there. And then, in addition to that, like, I've been comparing the characters in terms of which character arcs I feel are stronger and stuff like that, completely ignoring the fact that for a lot of people it may just be character preference that decides which series is more for you. Like, if you relate more to Korra and that cast of characters than the Avatar crew, that's a perfect reason why Korra is probably a better series for you than Avatar. If you relate more to the Avatar: The Last Airbender crew than the Korra crew, that's a perfect reason. I'm trying to be more kind of analytical here, but definitely there are reasons why both series are very good. So yeah, so final thoughts, I suppose, primarily here. I think it comes back to the format thing, which I talked about at the start of the video. That is the biggest factor. In this video, I talked about more negatives about Korra than I did about Avatar. As I said, the rule that I've really come to just base a lot of my thoughts on any series on is just err on the side of having too many episodes to tell your story than having too few. Because for me, the complaint of like, basically, I wish you had shown this, or done this, or this had had more time, this wasn't resolved, is a bigger complaint than, oh, they stretched this episode out a little bit, they could have done a bit more in this episode, or something like that. That, my issues with Korra fundamentally, like, oh, Jinora didn't get much time in book 4, Kai didn't get much time in book 4, Bataar Jr.'s plot wasn't resolved, and the book 3 villains didn't get much time, Kuvira could have had more time, are bigger than stuff like, book 1, the plot, there wasn't really much plot in book 1, there was a few episodes in book 2 and 3 that perhaps they were just kind of struggling for stuff to include. So for me, that is the factor that ultimately decides which one is better. So I'd say objectively, in terms of like ratings on websites and stuff like that, Avatar probably deserves a higher score than Korra, but it's still close. Like, I think Korra, like, 85 out of 100 probably in terms of a score. Avatar, like 80, 89, 90 maybe out of 100, but 1 and 2 for me for sure. Personally, there are things I enjoy about both series, and I can't really decide between the two in terms of personal lists, in terms of, as I said, so many of my favourite episodes of Avatar overall are in Korra. Some of my favourite characters, again, are in Korra, but some of them are also in Avatar. Personally, I can't really decide, but I say objectively, Avatar is the more solid series overall, I'd say. So that's my kind of final thoughts on here. Definitely in the comments let me know what your thoughts are on the conclusion of this series. Do you agree with anything I said here or disagree? Definitely let me know. But in terms of my next Avatar video, Basically, what I'm going to be doing in terms of replacing this weekly series will be, there'll also be one Avatar video a week in addition to the episode commentaries, and that's going to be next week. The first top 10 or 5 video, it's probably going to be Avatar The Last Airbender episodes, my ranking of my top 10 or 5 videos. It depends on how much time it takes me to talk about 10 episodes or 5 episodes. I'll probably do 10. I'm going to decide it now, yeah. Top 10 Avatar The Last Airbender lists sometime next week, maybe Wednesday. And then I'll decide what the next one is after that. So that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and thanks for watching the whole series, and bye.